Welcome to the Preparing for the Louisiana Educational Assessment Program for Science webinar. We're focused on science, and we're happy that you are here. I'm excited to introduce myself, my colleague, Emily. My name is Brendan Finch. Hello, howdy. I taught middle and high school science for 7 years. I left the classroom 10 years ago. That's a long time. To build Rockulate.com, so it's an adaptive reading website. And then we also have been building InterOrbit. So InterOrbit is focused on assessments for the NGSS, for the Louisiana state standards. We support lots of different states with three-dimensional assessment items. I am currently engaged in work. I started out writing the assessments on InterOrbit, and I'm currently engaged in some research where we are, building out informal practice. So think, as Brian in the chat mentioned, InterOrbit as a unit assessment, and now you want to give some sort of like daily practice, or maybe you gave it as a unit assessment and students struggled. And so we have other assessments or other activities we may give afterwards. And so we're kind of doing research on that right now to figure out if that's something we should pursue. I also just want to say for the record, as it starts to get colder outside, that hot cocoa is just way better with milk. And on that note, I'm excited to introduce my colleague, Emily.
Thank you, Brendan. I would also like to agree with Brendan. Hot cocoa being way better with milk. And then if you've got marshmallows in there, it's extra brownie points. So I'm Emily Miller. I was a high school chemistry teacher for 10 years. I taught in our alternative learning program. I taught regular chem, honors chem, so I had opportunities to try a plethora of different strategies with different kids with different learning needs. When I was a teacher, I considered myself to be an NGSS pioneer and advocate in my science department. And also, I was a PLC lead for data-driven dialogue. So I see a huge value in gathering the data and really being able to use the data to drive any instructional purposes or instructional goals that we might have. Now I have the pleasure of partnering with districts to help them implement InterOrbit. One of the states I work with is Louisiana, so I'm super happy to see all of you here. And honestly, I think savory is better than sweet. I'm not like a sweet hater, but like I will order an appetizer before dessert any day, and it makes me happy.
I love it. Thank you, Emily. I feel like you should have a chemical justification for that, where you should go in some like chemical thing where it's like, man, savory is like whatever. You could even tie in some evolutionary aspects to it. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about prepping for the leap. And we're excited that y'all are here with us. Thank you for being here. Just so you know, we are recording this. We will be sending out the recording to it probably tomorrow. So if you're watching this as a recording, hello, welcome. We always record stuff and post it to our YouTube channel. We're excited that you're here live. And if you're watching the recording, that's great too. We are here to explore the basics of sense making and strategies for how to use phenomena and questions to scaffold students for success on the leap. We're going to be talking about a few different things today. And the first of those things is what is InterOrbit. It's good to know what we are and what we do. And then we're going to talk about the sense-making paradigm shift. And we're going to look at a couple of different assessment tasks and try to figure out which one of these is actually three-dimensional or involves sense-making. This is always fun. And then we'll talk about how we can scaffold sense-making. So we want to approach that really rigorous task and find out what ways that we can approach that over time. One of those things is going to be using phenomena threaded unit. As we work with more and more districts that are using phenomena-driven curriculum, we want to provide opportunities for you to use additional phenomena as a layer on top of the phenomena that you have in your curriculum. And that's fun. And then we're going to play a game called What Does This Data Tell Us? In which we're kind of just going to show you what our reports look like, and it is going to tell you a story. And then we're going to close. And that's pretty much it. So make it so. All right, first thing, what is InterOrbit? If you're not familiar with InterOrbit, it is real simple. We're a website, and on the website, we do a couple things. The first is we have this phenomena. On the LEAP, students have to take their knowledge and they have to apply that knowledge through the lens of a novel phenomena on the test. So students need to have background knowledge and they need to be familiar with that process of transfer. We call that sense making in the NGSS parlance. And so that's not the right word, it doesn't matter. But what we want to do is allow students the ability to take what they're learning in class and apply it to a novel phenomena. And because we want students to slowly approach that over time, we write these really specific questions to allow them to take their understanding from class and slowly demonstrate either that they know things, they can make connections between those things, and then they can fully answer three-dimensional questions. And to service that and to allow you to answer the question, what now? We have really, really, really detailed reports. So I know some people that are here use an Orbit already. That's absolutely wonderful. But I'm excited to push you even further into how you use the site. And first, we're going to start with why. We're going to start with the why of these new standards. And we're going to talk about sense making and this paradigm shift. And I do believe that understanding what students need to do on the leap and understanding what students are meant to do as scientists or even as civilians that participate, we do want them to understand sense making and be able to take what they are learning and apply that to other things. So we're going to do that through the lens of a very specific standard. This is a middle school life science standard, MS-LS 4.1. And in this standard, students need to analyze and interpret data for patterns in the fossil record that document the existence, diversity, extinction, and change of life forms throughout the history of life on Earth, under the assumption that natural laws operate today as in the past. This is a third-dimensional standard, which means students are analyzing data. They need to understand that there is evidence of common ancestry and diversity. And finally, they need to do all of that through the lens of the cross-cutting concept of patterns. All right, we've set the stage. And now let's just say in this make-believe unit that we're teaching, we use this phenomena. And you've probably seen an image like this before, where it shows layers of rock and there's different fossils in the different layers. And this is our instructional phenomena. And let's just say we have a whole unit and we're like, there are these scientists, they're on an island and they find amber and there are dinosaurs. And we don't have to go total Jurassic Park with this, but let's just say we have like this, we're exploring an area and we found all these different fossils at these different levels. And that's our instructional phenomena. And now we're going to go into our test, our assessment afterwards. So the question I want to ask is, which assessment is the closest to sense making or proficiency? And if you're wondering, hey, what's that standard that you had up there a minute ago? Well, it's over there on the side of the screen. And so it's analyze and interpret data for patterns in the fossil record that document the existence, diversity, extinction, and change of life forms throughout the history of life on Earth, under the assumption that natural laws operate today as in the past. All right, 4 questions, assuming that this follows that lesson on the diversity of fossils. 4 different teachers are going to give assessments, and I want you to tell me in the chat which one of these is closest to proficiency or closest to sense making, which one is closest to what the standard would ask students to do. Teacher number 1, using that instructional image, cite 2 pieces of evidence that living things have changed over time. Teacher number 2 says, with that instructional image, write a CER statement to explain whether fossil 1 or fossil 2 was alive for longer. Teacher number 3 says, given a new image, cite 2 pieces of evidence to show that patterns in the fossil record show that living things have changed. And finally, teacher number 4, given a new table of data, draw a diagram to show the differences between when different fossils lived. All right, in the chat, which teacher is closest to proficiency, closest to that standard, closest to sense making? And also add why you think it is teacher 1, 2, 3, or 4. Let's take a minute, review these different teacher tasks, and tell me which one and why. Great responses, y'all. So I see folks saying teacher 3 because there's analysis, they're interpreting data. I see folks saying teacher 4 because they're provided with data. I see 3 or 4 also, which is really, really interesting too. Fantastic job. I love it. Something I just want to call out that I think is really cool is that in the chat, people are calling out the specific language of the questions. So people said, number 3, ask for patterns, showing changes in diversity through geologic time. Patterns shows diversity and change over time. I really like that. Analyzing data by identifying the pattern. Those are different responses in the chat. And each one of those picks out the language that is in that question. All right. So you may not be surprised to learn that teacher 3 was right. Given a new image, cite 2 pieces of evidence to show that patterns in the fossil record show that living things have changed. Now, an important thing to note here is that all of these teachers, all of these students were engaged in rigorous tasks, but they're not sense making. And the reality is that they're not going to prepare students for the test. That novel phenomena, given a new image, that's actually the most crucial part of that task. Students need to see a novel phenomena on the leap. They're going to see a novel phenomena in all of the assessments they go through. And they're going to explicitly use the cross-cutting concept, the DCI, and the SEP All right. So now I want you to think about this together. Could this teacher, let's just say that task is a free response question. Could this teacher have used a multiple choice question to gauge proficiency? Why or why not? I really like this last response. Yes, if the item was two parts. Part A, identify the pattern, and part B, use the correct evidence. I like that. So I see folks saying if the question was scaffolded correctly, carefully worded, and would be difficult at all parts. Yeah, I think that the reality is that students here they're analyzing and interpreting data, which means that not only are they identifying a pattern, but they need to analyze that data. And so that concept of being able to analyze and interpret data, it's maybe something you could approach. You could probably get some signal that students are approaching proficiency. And the tricky part about standards like this is that truthfully, they need some sort of justification. So I really like the option to say now which evidence shows you that, which is great. But it would be really tricky to get students to show evidence of proficiency with a multiple choice question with this. It would have to be a really carefully worded question. We see a lot of questions where it's like this because, and each of the responses has a thorough analysis of that. And they have to choose the correct analysis, which I think is the closest that you can get to this with a multiple choice question. So I totally agree with the chat and everyone who mentioned that. Fantastic, y'all. Okay. Thank you very, very much. I really, really appreciate you walking through those slides with me and considering that we're not just asking students to do something that is rigorous, we're asking students to engage in sense making. We're asking them to do something rigorous with a novel phenomena that uses the DCI, the SEP, and the cross-cutting concept. With that now, I'm going to pass it off to Emily to talk a little bit more about how we might be able to scaffold up to sense making. Emily, can you walk us through how we might scaffold up to sense making?
Absolutely. Thank you, Brendan. Yeah, question like that. I loved all of your guys is like pulling apart, like Brendan said, but like, how do we get students to do something beefy like that? So really, I think kind of the shift that Brendan was talking about is kind of going from this idea of just students representing what they know and then truly sense making. Because representation would be like students, copying down a chemical equation they've already seen before or drawing a model of a cell that they've already seen before. This is just showing what they know and not actually using what they know in a novel new situation while also incorporating the different components of the three dimensions like the SEP and the CCC. So as teachers, we're usually pretty comfortable teaching them stuff, right? But then we got to shift them over to this side. So how do we do that? The first thing we really want to do is leverage the SEPs and the CCCs. So we want to be really explicit with teaching students the skills that go along with the science and engineering practices, really be explicit when we're talking like what lens are we focusing on this situation for and try to model for that as much as possible and try to give them practice using these as much as possible. So I'll show you some questions here in a bit that do just that. And then the other thing we want to do is we really want to show them novel phenomena as much as possible. We don't want them to be seeing novel phenomena for the first time on a summative because students haven't had a chance to really flex those muscles and flex those sense-making skills until the end. So we want them to get comfortable with being uncomfortable by looking at something new and using their skills in that new light and in that new way. So the first part I'm actually going to be focusing on is the leveraging the SEPs and the CCCs in terms of the performance expectation. Then we'll talk about how you can use phenomena throughout a unit. So I'm going to show you a series of questions that are all pulled from Inner Orbit, and all of the questions that were pulled from Inner Orbit all belong to this performance expectation. So we've got another middle school life science standard, which is develop a model to describe the cycling of matter and flow of energy among living and non-living parts of an ecosystem. So in order to do proficiency, sense making, students have to understand the content of the cycle of matter and energy transfer within an ecosystem. They need to be able to develop and use models to describe phenomena, and they need to look at this through the lens of energy and matter, the idea that transfer of energy can be tracked as energy flows through a natural system. So just to keep that frame of reference while I show you some example questions here. So we're going to scaffold them up there, right? So where do we start? We do start with the content. Okay, so we just start with teaching them stuff, but more specifically, we want to figure out what they know first. So on inner orbit, all of our clusters, items, are all connected to a novel phenomena, and they all start with prior knowledge questions. So I know the text is tiny, but at the very bottom of this orange thing, you're going to see that it's 5 LS21. So this is actually a 5th grade standard. Because before we start scaffolding up to sense making, we kind of want to make sure they actually know what they're supposed to know before we start teaching them the new stuff. So I always recommend start with prior knowledge questions, go back a little bit and give that to students first. So then you can figure out where you're going to be starting your scaffolding from. Because if you start here and they're here, you're going to have a lot harder time to get them there. Once you know that they've mastered those prior knowledge questions, and you'll be able to figure out how they've mastered that with the data that Brendan's going to talk you through later, then you can actually get onto the core content questions for the appropriate grade level. So this middle school type of question. So this is just, do students understand ecosystems? Do they understand this flow of energy and matter? Because if they don't know the information, they can't really apply it to novel situations either. So the first thing we want to do is we just want to understand if students know the content. Once they're comfortable with knowing the content, that is when we can start leveraging the SEPs and the CCCs. And we've found that the SEPs is really a place where students need a lot of support. So on Inner Orbit, we actually have an entire section that is dedicated to SEP only questions. So what that means is, if you look at this problem, while it does talk about a plant and the sun, truly students don't necessarily need to know content to answer this question. They just need to be able to look at the model and interpret what is happening. This idea that if a plant does not have sunlight, it may die. So in this case, we really are giving students a chance just to leverage the skill of models. Can they read a model? Can they interpret a model? There's different types of ways you can use models moving throughout the unit. But in this case, this way, we just want to see like some unobservable mechanism. So we don't have 13 days to watch a plant die. So we can model to see what that would look like. So time just spent on content, and then we've got time just spent on leveraging the skill of developing and using models. Once you have some understanding that students have this down, now this is where we can merge the two. So this is where they're using the content with that skill. So in this question, we would call this a two-dimensional question because one, students need to apply the content that they've learned through the DCI, and they need to apply that information, that content that they've learned through the SEP. So they have to look at this food diagram. They have to be able to understand this model, what is going on, and understand the idea of consumers and decomposers and how that works within. So once you've got that chance to really assess students individually on content and skills, then you can put them together and say, okay, can they handle doing this together? And then once you have this idea of if they can do this together, that is when you can then go ahead and level up finally to sense making. Sense making is where you're going to be using all 3 dimensions all at once. So this is a similar question to what we were looking at prior, but the key difference here is we're now looking through it with the lens of the CCC and really understanding that transfer of energy and being able to track it. So how do we scaffold students up to sense making? We really need to break down the performance expectation into those individual dimensions and make sure that we're giving students a chance to practice those individual dimensions. So that's starting off with content. Again, doing prior knowledge first. Do they even know what they should know? Getting into grade level content. And then once you have that grade level content, practicing using it with the CCCs and the SEP. And honestly, taking some time to just focus on that SEP as well, really giving them the chance to use the skill of analyzing, interpreting data, developing and using models, coming up with an argument from evidence. And then we can get into that summative 3D question. So Brendan now is going to kind of introduce us to, now that we have this idea of how we can slowly scaffold questions up to sense making, where does that novel phenomena actually come into play?
And thank you so much, Emily. So I think that one of the things that we see teachers struggling with, obviously, is leveraging SEPs, cross-cutting concepts, giving practice to students in terms of how do I use that SEP and how do I build up that muscle over time. Now we want to talk a little bit more about using novel phenomena. And so what we see oftentimes is that when folks are thinking about preparing for a test, that they'll look at their instructional phenomena, and they'll look at an assessment phenomena. And they'll think about, oh, I want students to transfer their understanding from that instructional phenomena to an assessment phenomena. And that's great. But what we'd like to pose here is that you can actually dig in deeper and give students many different examples of ways they can make sense of novel phenomena. And we're going to look at a very, very specific unit. We're going to look at the OpenSciED 7.4. So we have lots of different partners that use OpenSciED, and InterOrbit is a layer on top of their work with OpenSciED. And so for this OpenSciED unit, there are a bunch of standards that students have to cover. So there's MSPS 1.3, MSLS 1.2, MSLS 1.6, and MSLS 2.3. So all of these things are within the scope of this unit, and it's all about syrup. And we're going to focus on the standard of MSLS 2.3 here and look at different ways that we could allow students to apply their understanding of this standard. And so in this standard, students need to develop a model to describe the cycle of matter and flow of energy among living and non-living parts of an ecosystem. And so again, just as we talked about prior, this involves developing these models. Students need to understand that matter and energy cycle in ecosystems between living and non-living parts. And then finally, that there is a transfer of energy and matter, and we can track those things as they flow throughout a system. So I'm going to pass it to Emily, who's going to walk us through kind of a roadmap for how we could use this unit and this standard and provide students with multiple different phenomena to sort of take their understanding and continuously apply it over and over. Back to you, Emily.
Thank you, Brendan. I do want to be clear that while we picked OpenSciED just to have a concrete example, any NGSS aligned curriculum that has like an anchoring phenomena or any type of phenomena, you could completely put in place of this. We just wanted to give a concrete example, just so in case there was a matchup, that'd be cool. But if you're using any NGSS aligned curriculum, you can apply this exact same philosophy. So what we've seen with a lot of NGSS aligned curriculum is they all have this anchoring phenomena. So something to kind of open up the unit, something to get students pondering, to get them wondering. And then the idea is that this anchoring phenomena keeps coming back up throughout the unit. I see this as a really awesome opportunity for teachers to kind of, one, give students a chance to ponder, wonder, use their skills, but to also model the skills that we're learning in terms of the anchoring phenomena, kind of like a thinking out loud, like, oh, okay, well, I'm wondering, where is this maple syrup coming from? Because that's providing energy for our body. So was that providing energy for the tree? Where did the tree get its energy? So you can kind of start modeling that questioning and that thinking, and it gives you something to keep referring back to. So if you just practiced developing and using models, bring it back to maple syrup. If you just practiced talking about like the cycle of matter, bring it back to maple syrup. So that way students constantly have an example in their head. So keeping that idea as a through thread. Obviously, we're going to throw in our lessons, right? We're going to throw in our labs and our activities and our lectures and all that good stuff. And if you look here, I picked lessons 12, 13, and 14. So I just picked one particular part of the unit to focus on because the mid-unit inner orbit cluster I looked at was MSLS 2.4 or MSLS 2.3. I'm getting all my numbers mixed up. What's the scoop with worm poop? So all of those questions earlier that I was showing you how to scaffold to sense making actually came from this exact inner orbit cluster. So lessons 12, 13, and 14 from OpenSciED have a focus on MSLS 3.2, have this focus on this specific performance expectation. So after those lessons, this would be a great time to pause and give a formative assessment for students on all the different elements of that performance expectation. And then from there, in a perfect world, we would go back and we would re-instruct content and or skills based on the data that we would get from this mid-unit inner orbit cluster. And again, Brendan's going to be talking about that data here in a sec. But it's hard, right? It's hard to go back and to do re-instruction because as much as we would all love it, we do not have an infinite amount of time. So when you have that moment where students do poorly on a mid-unit formative and you're like, crap, like we got to keep going if we're going to finish everything, if we're going to get to all of our other units. The data, by using these mid-unit formatives, gives you a really clear lens and a really clear scope of, oh, I need to look at the SEP. Oh, I need to look at the CCC. Oh, it's the content. It gives you a really specific lens to look at the instruction from, so you can go back and give really targeted support in a much more efficient manner than going, crap, they all bombed that. Now what do I do? Or hopefully they don't, because you're a rock star, perfect world. And then after you give these mid-unit clusters, again, throughout a unit, whenever like lessons kind of wrap up a performance expectation, then at the end of the unit, you're going to want to give a summative. And again, you're going to pull different novel phenomena from whatever sources you have. So Inner Orbit has plenty. And we have so many, in fact, for this one performance expectation. We have 6 different phenomena and over 107 questions just on that one performance expectation. Now, if you think back to the beginning of this Open SciEd unit, there was 4 performance expectations in it. So if you can scale this up, you could have potentially 400 questions available to you. So pulling 1 or 2 of these novel phenomena throughout the unit after you kind of cover a chunk of lessons to have students have some formative practice, you would still have a lot to offer on the summative at the end because you have so many available to you. So I keep talking about this data. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. Brendan, do you want to take it from?
Of course, and thank you so much, Emily. Just to go back to this, so each of these different phenomena, so on Inner Orbit or wherever you're finding those things, we want to tie back to that instructional phenomena. We want to ask students, how does this relate to the cycling of matter that we learned about with the maple syrup in the Open SciEd unit, or in the Illinois Storyline, or whatever unit you're using? We want to keep on returning back to those things, and so that students make explicit connections between the things they're learning in class and their ability to apply that through the lens of these other novel phenomena, because on the leap, they're going to see other phenomena that are not one of these phenomena. Maybe, but probably not, because there are a lot of them. And so outside of just the ability to take your understanding from instruction and tie that into, a very specific phenomena, how can we go back and use our data to now say, what now? Like, what are my next steps? If I'm going to go back, and getting through these units can be tricky, but figuring out what students need and focusing your instruction on that really, really discrete thing, that's the most, by far, the highest yield activity that we can do as educators. So let's look at this standard, this ecosystem standard. And if we dive into the Inner Orbit reports, we can take a look at just the DCIs and really specifically look at LS2. So in the standard of ecosystems, there are actually a bunch of substandards. And if we click on that in the dimensions report in Inner Orbit, we can break down and see, oh, actually, so there's LS2A and LS2B. And just to be clear, so this percentage of 65% that we're seeing on our reports, that's the number of students that answer questions correctly that are tied to that DCI. And so if you ask DCI only questions, DCI and SEP questions, or 3-dimensional questions, all 3 of those things will feed into this number, because we want to get a well-rounded view of, like, not just do students understand ecosystems, but they understand it in each of those contexts. And then we can dig down even further and say, okay, so they did better on interdependent relationships and ecosystems. They struggled a little bit more with the cycle of matter and energy transfer in ecosystems. And really specifically, we can even dive down in from the 3-5 and say they did pretty well on that, to the 6-8 grade level band to say, all right, very, very specifically, like food webs and the transfer of matter between decomposers and producers and consumers within an ecosystem. Maybe students don't understand. They understand the idea that energy and matter, like, goes between different things, but like the actual atoms, the actual molecules, the particles that you eat came from other things. And before that, they were other things. And before that, they were other things. And so this enables us to really hone in on that discrete thing and say, students understood the 5th grade standard. Now we just need to work on that middle school standard later on. We can also look at data through the lens of the SEPs. And so as you give those SEP practice problems, and as you ask questions that involve the 2 dimensions, so any DCI only questions are not going to feed into this data. Any questions involving a cross-cutting concept will not feed into this data. On Inner Orbit, at least, it'll just be questions where you address the SEP. And so if you're not familiar, the SEP involve lots of very discrete skills at each of the different grade level bands where students need to show progress. So we can look at something like developing user models and say, all right, students did great on 3-5. And just for some context, so when we look at state test scores and we look at these percentages on Inner Orbit, so Inner Orbit does not norm our scores. So that means literally, if you asked 100 questions or you ask a question to 100 students, 87% of them answered questions correctly around analyzing and interpreting data. 81% of questions were answered correctly around developing these models. And in all of the states whose test scores we've analyzed, that would be at the advanced category. If your students are scoring 80%, they are doing fantastic. That is really amazing. Honestly, 60% and up in many states is advanced. And so you need to reference your state's test scores specifically, and these numbers change over time. But as states get new data from the LEAP or from the KSA in Kentucky or the New York intermediate assessments, you're going to see those cut score numbers changing over time, and the norm for each of those different bands will shift over time. So just with a little bit of detail on that. So what we can do is we can dive into the 6-8 grade level band and say, all right, like the thing that students are struggling with is develop and or use a model to predict and or describe phenomena. And if that's the thing that we need to talk about, just developing models or using models that either predict, here's what happened here, what's going to happen next, or describe, so what is happening in this scenario. Use a model to visually explain to me what's happening. Super, super, super beneficial. And then we can also do the same work in different SEPs and see where students are struggling or they're being more successful. And then we can give more assessments on that same standard and say, did we move the needle in the context of earth science or life science or physical science? That's what's so great about the SCPs is that you can see these over each of those different domains. And then finally, the cross-cutting concepts. I know this is like the dimension that just doesn't get as much love, but it deserves it. You are worthy cross-cutting concepts. So energy and matter flows, cycles, and conservation is one of those standards that you see this in a lot of different content. And so we can dig into that and click into that and see what grade level bands that appears and see really discrete parts of that really specific cross-cutting concept at the middle school level and say, all right, the thing we're going to talk about is that the transfer of energy can be tracked as energy flows through a designed or natural system. So like Emily said earlier, that energy from the maple syrup, that gives, or that there's energy in that maple syrup. Like we get to use that energy. Where did that come from? And then where did it come from before that? And like, how did that happen? But anytime energy is entering into one part of the system, you can track where it came from and you can track where it goes. Like some of that energy is just like floating off of my bald head right now. And I didn't have any maple syrup today, but I wish I did. And so we can track that energy over time as energy flows and as energy moves from one place to another, that energy, we can track that. We can look at how much is lost as heat, how much is transferred into motion, and then how much is like left over afterwards. So those are really, really important things. Speaking of really important things, thank you all so much for joining us for this webinar. Super simple, super quick. We actually finished early, which is fantastic. We usually don't. So thank you all very, very much for joining us for the webinar. It was absolutely fantastic to get to walk you through everything that we did. So we talked about some basics of sense making and some strategies for using phenomena and questions to scaffold students for success on the LEAP. We went through a bunch of different parts, and if you have any questions, we're happy to answer your questions. But otherwise, I hope y'all have a beautiful rest of your day. And as Captain Picard said, make it so. That's for the beautiful day part. But thanks, y'all. Appreciate you.